Hello, dear friends. Today we will take a look at the memoirs of German veteran Gustav Rever. His service was in the 2nd Paratroop, Panzergrenadier Division Hermann Göring. This is the miraculous story of a man who was about to serve in the Luftwaffe, but was sent to the Eastern Front as an ordinary infantryman. Now, let's begin. I was born in 1924 in Osnabrück, North Germany. After graduating from high school in Freiburg in 1942, and after reaching draft age, I chose to join the Luftwaffe, with the hope of being a pilot. Thereafter, I was sent to Nancy in France to complete basic military training. In March 1943, I completed my basic military training. I got an assignment to an Air Force base in Holland, where I was until the middle of the year. It made me very proud to serve in the German military forces at that time. I felt it especially strong when I was on guard duty and had a chance to admire the Focke-Wulf 190 planes so close up. This summer, after Allied aircraft strikes, there were craters between 5 and 15 meters in depth on the flying field. It was my and my comrades' job to fill them up with rocks and soil to keep the runway operational. It is remembered that we also got orders to extend the runway. It was rumored so that we could accept a new type of aircraft, with no propellers. We assumed it was just someone else's joke, but in fact the runway was indeed being extended for Messerschmitt Me 262 planes. I had unfortunately been reassigned before those machines had arrived. In the spring of 1944, I was sent to southern Germany for training at the gliding school, the first stage of training pilots. It was also there that we studied navigating, meteorology, etc. Then I began my flight practice on a small single-engine aircraft with an instructor. Nevertheless, the circumstances changed radically in May or June of 1944. I and many of my fellow cadets received a notice that we would be reassigned to the ground forces, perhaps in a Luftwaffe division or just to infantry because of the heavy fuel shortage resulting from the Allied air attacks on the Romanian airfields. What is to say, even experienced pilots from bomber air crews, most of whom had military awards, were also getting assigned to the infantry. It was without much delay to send me and many of my fellow cadets to the Eastern Front in the middle of the summer. There, a huge Russian offensive was confronted by the units we joined. Their offensive caused the destruction of Army Group Center. Originally, we were hoping we would be sent to Italy. That would not be such a bad thing. But I, as well as some of my comrades, were assigned to the 22nd Paratroop Panzergrenadier Division, Hermann Göring. At that time, the division was in defensive positions on the Vistula River to the south of Warsaw. My assignment was as a machine gunner in the infantry company. Frankly speaking, I stayed scared as hell for the whole time. When I found myself on the front line in October 1944, I was engaged in digging trenches and dugouts for the first few weeks of being on the front line, mostly at night. There were long nights, and the Russians fired their flares into the sky at night, seeming to keep burning longer and brighter than the German ones. Being a machine gunner with an MG-42, I faced something that was typical of the last year of the war. I was pissed off by the 7.92mm cartridges as their steel casings were lacquered in order to stop rusting. There was a lack of brass and copper alloys for normal casings, like those used in the early war. The lacquered cartridges were jamming the machine gun slide as the lacquer was melting from the heating and bulging. Another problem with the MG-42 was its rate of fire. It caused the barrel to get overheated, reducing the accuracy of the gun and causing it to jam very often. In an effort to prevent this, in the shortage of time to replace the barrel, my number 2 occasionally covered the barrel with snow to keep it cool. My number 2 had an MP-44 assault rifle, using which he was keeping the Russians at a distance while I was reloading the machine gun or replacing the barrel of the gun. Getting prepared for an offensive, the Russians always bombarded our positions with their mortars. In fact, the mortars were the principal Russian weapon. Moreover, for 10 minutes before the offensive, they used to fire smoke shells, thus reducing our visibility to only 10 meters. The Russians had also used 76mm artillery guns, and we called them Ratchbums. They shot a direct fire, and the shell exploded above the ground. It's difficult to find an adequate cover from these explosions in opened trenches. I guess it was not the purpose of the Russians to use this type of shells to kill an enemy soldier. The main purpose was to knock someone out and force 2 or 3 of his comrades to leave the front line in order to evacuate the wounded soldier to the rear and thereby make our defenses weaker before the offensive. We sometimes were not able to set up wire fences in front of our trenches to delay the attacks of the Russians. We simply ran out of wire, but we set mine obstacles, which was effective. We were digging the second line of trenches about 200 meters after the main line, where we retreated to whenever the Russians succeeded in breaking through the first line of defense. Second line of trenches was always covered with snow, and it was very bad when we jumped into it. After that, we had to clean the snow out of the trenches. There was also another type of weapon commonly used by the Russians on the Eastern Front at night, the biplanes, the ones we called Na-machine, or flying sewing machine. These aircraft used to night bomb everything that happened to be under them. One day, the pilot of one of these planes mistook the German positions for the Russian positions and attacked it. It made us laugh a little, a rare opportunity for fun at that time on the Eastern Front. These planes were also dropping leaflets encouraging us to give up and making it clear that the war had been lost. What I remember is that one morning a Russian patrol lost its way into the no man's land and came close to our positions, assuming they were on their way to the Russians. They found themselves under fire from our ambush, and the Russians ran away, dropping their weapons and all their equipment. Persistent daytime threats to us were the Russian snipers. No one among us ever dared stick his head out above the parapet in fear of being shot by the enemy snipers, all of whom had a reputation for being excellent marksmen. The uniform we wore consisted of a blue wadded jacket and blue wadded pants, common winter clothing in the Luftwaffe. There was no relation to the Luftwaffe in our field caps. Over that, we wore camouflage jackets and winter pants. During the winter, we just did not remove any of our clothes. It was impossible for us to do that. Moreover, I never got a blanket, so I slept in my clothes. I was lucky with my shoes, though. I had the boots that were given to paratroopers. These boots felt warmer and drier than any other footwear provided by the German army. For months I wore them, since I was constantly on the front line, and the Russians threatened to attack at any moment. Instead of wearing socks, I wore Fußlappen, which made my feet feel drier in the muddy trenches. As most of my comrades, I had a standard helmet, though our platoon commander, a lieutenant, was wearing an airborne helmet, but I'm not sure if he ever served as a paratrooper. I also wore a red army soldier's belt. One day I came across the frozen corpse of a Russian soldier, looked around for food and valuable belongings, and managed to get the belt off him. Not Soviet soldiers, but the weather, which seemed to be made up of continuous rain, mud, cold, snow, and gusty winds, were our real enemy. For 5 months in a row, I lived in the trenches in Poland and East Prussia. It was life under the open air, with no roof above my head, cold and damp. For example, our defensive line in East Prussia had anti-personnel mine strip, a main line of zigzag trenches, and a second defensive line made up of a series of gun positions linked by trenches that were oriented perpendicularly to each other. There was a farm about 200 meters behind one of the defensive positions, where the company field kitchen drove up to unload the daily or evening rations. The daily rations normally consisted of a bread ration. Once a day, there was a hot meal, usually potato and vegetable soup, because there was no meat anymore, even at the front. At least one time I got a special ration pack that was marked for infantrymen on the front lines only. I remember that package contained some cookies, dried fruit, cigarettes, instant coffee, and tablets of glucose. On one occasion, I got another package, which contained breadcrumbs. Basically, I was always hungry. So hungry that the first thing I used to do when I came across a corpse was to check it for provisions. I searched the pockets and equipment of both my fellow soldiers and enemies. As my friend got killed in combat, I searched his corpse too. It was the only thing left. Stuff like foot powder, set of sewing needles and thread, or other things necessary for a soldier were given to those who were in the occupation units in Denmark or Norway, and who got time to sew on buttons, etc. Actually, button sewing and maintaining uniforms was a rareness of life at the front, as soldiers there had different concerns such as staying alive. If we were not sleeping in the trenches, remaining close to the front lines, my comrades and I never slept in buildings. It was always the Russian artillery aim, so we slept in the nearest woods. As the lack of basic needs became more and more common in our army, some of the equipment came into wider and wider use. The one called the Holzkocher. It was a kind of wood-burning stove on a truck just behind the driver's cab. You could burn 4 by 4 by 4 centimeter wooden blocks in it, and it was considered that these stoves helped the vehicle to reduce fuel consumption. The truth is that they gave more soot. They were unreliable and did not give enough traction. For a 30 to 50 kilometer trip, you had to burn 10 bags of these blocks. There was a joke like this among us. Germany created a new 70-ton super tank with a heavy gun and strong armor. that could destroy any tank of the Allies. The truth is, to get it into action, you need to have 20 tankers behind the turret who will chop the wood. The discipline, even in the famous units that carried the Hermann Göring name, has been extremely cruel at times. One day, an officer halted 3 soldiers walking along the road away from the front lines. He immediately charged them with desertion and executed them with an MP-44 right there on the spot. It was in front of my eyes. With my comrades, I approached the bodies and looked them over for food as soon as the officer left my sight. On March 15, 1945, in the battle near Heiligenbiel, I was wounded in my leg. I never noticed the wound until the blood flowed into my shoe. A shrapnel hit the flesh behind my left knee, but it hit no artery or bone. I made my way to the battalion dressing station on my own because I did not want to be captured. I had already witnessed what happened to the men who had been wounded and captured by the Russians. The dressing station was in a large barn with many soldiers, some of them bleeding after more serious wounds. There was an officer standing in line in front of me. He was so badly shell-shocked that he could not understand any of the orderly's questions. What was going on there was terrible. I saw the surgeons operating on the conscious soldiers without anesthetics. When my wound had been cleaned, I and several others were taken by truck to the harbor, loaded onto a boat, and transported to Palau. I remember the attack by Russian planes. There was one that flew so close to me that I could see the face of the plane's gunner. Finally, they loaded me and the other wounded men onto a larger vessel going to Copenhagen. By then, an infection was in my wound. I couldn't even feel my leg anymore, and I thought I would lose it. Our vessel was attacked by Russian airplanes, but our anti-aircraft gunners repulsed them. My wound was being treated by the surgeons on board of the ship, but I felt nothing. In the hospital in Copenhagen, I got better very fast, but I stayed there until May 8, 1945. In August 1945, I found myself in Kiel, in the British occupation zone. When I and my wounded comrades stepped off the vessel, the British soldiers confiscated literally everything we had: pocket knives, watches, pens, etc. But as a sign of respect, they did not confiscate our military awards. All in all, the British were very good to us and gave us a good feed. They gave us pamphlets stating that Germany had began the war, and it was Adolf Hitler's fault that millions of people were murdered. They also told us that German industry would be totally deconstructed to ensure that Germany would never cause a war again. In September 1945, I was given permission to go back to Osnabrück, a city which had been 75% destroyed by bombing attacks. In 1957, while I was on leave in Yugoslavia, I met my future wife, a U.S. citizen. We got married, and I immigrated to America, settled in Indianapolis, working as a civilian in the U.S. Navy until I retired. And now, when I go to bed, I often find myself remembering the moments on the Eastern Front. After almost 70 years, I struggle to accept the simple fact that no one will break into my bedroom shouting that the Russians are on the attack. And there is no longer any need for me to run as fast as I can to my fire point in the trenches to have my trusty MG42 ready for the battle. And that's it for today. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and support the channel with your subscription. Goodbye to everyone, and see you all later.